All right, thanks, Daniel. So we're going to get started today. This is a special session on thinking about how climate change affects tree species. And so as we get started today, we'll be talking about a few different ways it ties into how we can think about how climate change affects tree species, and this complements the work that we do in step 2 of the adaptation workbook, thinking about forest vulnerability. It's also a good beginning level of information that if you wanted to think about climate change tree species later on in the adaptation workbook in step 4 when we talk about adaptation, this is also really relevant information to come back to at that stage. So we used to try and cram all this into the step 2 lecture and it became too much. So this is a really great opportunity to be able to talk specifically about some of these tools that are available. The other great thing is we'll be covering the Climate Change Tree Atlas, and I just had a massive update on the Forest Service's Northern Research Station's website. And so we'll be talking about how to use it for tree species projections for 125 eastern tree species, as well as heat and hardiness zone data if you don't have the tree species themselves. One thing is we're going to cover both of these, and one thing that might be helpful for us is if you wanted to chat in, whether you're talking about working in natural forests, either rurally or in natural areas within a developed landscape, or if you're specifically in urban areas, if you want to just chat that in and let us know, that can give us a little bit better sense of who's in the room and kind of which tutorials we might emphasize. If we have a lot of people working specifically in urban areas with street trees, we'll know to spend and create a little bit more time for that at the end. Let's see here. So thanks for that. So you guys know me by now. I'm Maria Genoviak with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and one of the co-instructors for this course. And then I'm also going to let Steve introduce himself because he's, and maybe the LCRG since he's our guest lecturer.
Great. Sorry, school just took a break on me. Yes. So, so Steve Matthews. So with Ohio State and Northern Research Station, so Landscape Change Research Group, it's really been something we've been working on developing the tree atlas really for the last 20 years. And so our efforts have been to understand, where species are currently distributed, how those habitats will change. And, we're really excited to be able to kind of release the latest version of the tree atlas. And it's always great to see how the atlas is used in all these great planning modes. And so this is something we really are excited about, and it's great to actually see the research kind of being implemented on the ground. And so it'd be fun to kind of demo some of the new features of the atlas today, and also to get some of your questions about what it can and can't be used for.
Great, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so what we'll be doing today is just give you a quick overview of the Climate Change Tree Atlas and talking about how you can use it to assess today. We're going to be focusing on these 125 tree species in the eastern US. The tree atlas, so we're on version 4 of the tree atlas. It was just updated. There's also the bird atlas, which builds on the tree information, and that's actually a tool that Steve leads. We won't be talking about that, but it is built on the same framework and a lot of the principles apply. So if you're interested in tree species or in bird species, you should also check that out. And again, like I said at the beginning, really this information can be used to assess whether your current tree species are at risk from climate change, as well as, thinking about how do you facilitate or promote or kind of create conditions that are favorable for future adapted tree species in your projects, whether that's naturally or through artificial means. Oh no, there's going to be a bunch of animation because I didn't take it off. All right. So one of the things about the Climate Change Tree Atlas is we're in the midst of developing these tutorials, and so they have great animation, but I maybe didn't delete it all. Is that there are 3 components to the Climate Change Tree Atlas, and I'll describe each really briefly to start us off, and then basically we'll roll into a demo kind of in 3 chunks of what the Tree Atlas can do and some of the other tools, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So just in terms of what the Tree Atlas is, the Tree Atlas is a website, it's a web-based tool, but there's really 3 parts to it. There's a habitat suitability component that's powered by a distribution model. There's migration potential, which is a part that's really been expanded in this latest version. And then there's information about tree species traits. So when we talk about the atlas, we kind of talk about all of these, although, you know, a lot of times we're focusing on the habitat suitability results. We wanted to kind of pull it apart and show you these 3 different pieces, because depending on the question you're going to ask, you might be looking at certain components in particular. So there's 125 tree species in this. So the first piece is habitat suitability. And this is, you know, the maps part, and Steve will show us what these look like. And so this is, if you've been on the tree atlas, this is probably what you've seen, because people like to look at these maps of current distribution of tree species versus future projected habitat. And so the way this works, just briefly, is that what we do is we use forest inventory and analysis data that's collected by the Forest Service to understand where tree species are currently located. So that's the figure on the left, and the darker the colors, the more abundant the species is in that particular place. I believe this example is slash pine, just for a species. And so you can see where the tree species currently is. And what the modelers do, and Steve will be able to correct me, but the easy version that I can understand of it is that they basically look at what are the relationships between where a tree species is found and the temperature, the precipitation, the soil conditions, and the other kind of site conditions associated with it. So they look at the relationship, and you can say, well, a particular species is associated with, you know, certain climate, certain soil conditions, maybe certain latitude or slope or aspect, and it's able to kind of put together, you know, here are the types of sites where you would expect to find slash pine or another species. And then what they do is they put in the future climate projections and look at where those relationships hold in the future. So it's not saying where a tree species will move to, it's saying here's where those habitat conditions are likely to exist in the future. And that's how we create these maps. And then there's maps, and when you get into the tree atlas, as we'll see, there's maps for a variety of different emissions scenarios for climate change in terms of low amounts of change versus high amounts of change. And you can kind of compare and contrast and see, you know, maybe how sensitive a particular species is to moving based on different scenarios of climate change. So that's the habitat suitability component. One of the pieces that was just really recently added, and Steve can speak more to this, but with this latest version is of the Atlas, version 4, is the colonization potential. So in the past, it's been, you know, here's where a species is, and then here's all the potential future habitat it might have. But we know that species don't move quickly. You know, tree species are like long-lived, slow-moving species, and that without assistance in terms of helping migrate, helping these species migrate, they're not going to necessarily be able to move on their own. And so colonization potential, which is a migration model called SHIFT, helps to understand at historic or kind of prehistoric post-ice age rates of tree species migration, where might we expect tree species to actually move in the landscape? So of all the potential habitat that might be suitable, which is actually likely to be able to be colonized given that tree species move slowly and the landscape is highly fragmented, if that makes sense. So the migration potential can really help identify, you know, maybe the best places to move species or where species might move into based on them being closer to existing populations and having some other conditions. And then again, sorry for the animations. The third component to the tree atlas is called adaptability. Adaptability is really trying to get at what are all the species traits that aren't modeled by the tree atlas, because we can't model things like competition or disturbance or a tree species response to those things. And so adaptability scores, which are also in some of the earlier versions called modification factors, are these biological and disturbance factors that account for things that aren't covered in the models. And so we can basically use it to kind of turn a species up or down in terms of its projections. And so a really good example in this figure, in the upper right is red maple. Red maple has the highest adaptability score of any tree species that we model, because it's just so adaptable to so many conditions. It has a high adaptability score. So, it responds well to disturbance. It's highly competitive. It just can tolerate so many wide-ranging site conditions. And so you can imagine that even if a red maple doesn't show up as having a ton of suitable habitat, it's going to be a better competitor. And so it has this higher adaptability score. So we can kind of layer these information pieces on. We're working to develop tutorials for all of these things that will provide more information. So we know that we're giving you a bit of a fire hose in terms of the tools, and we hope this is helpful. This tool has so much that you can explore, but we want to just cover kind of some of the basics as we go today. So I'm going to stop, pause, and see if there are any quick questions, but then basically we're going to turn it over to Steve. He's going to give us some demos. As we do that, I am going to actually have everyone turn their cameras off so we can just see the full screen and really take in the demos. And you can chat in any questions that you have. We'll try and kind of pause in a few places to take questions. And then we'll have more Q&A at the end. How does that sound? Great. All right. I'm going to stop sharing, Steve, and I'll turn it over to you.
Maria, while you,
yeah.
I just had a quick question on that last slide as far as the adaptability, where drought would fall in on which matrix.
Yes. Disturbance. Yeah, it would fall on this. Yeah. Yep. No. Yep. Exactly. No. And again, we were developing those. It was like, where do we put some of these? And the idea, if we go back to the original kind of topic of it, we were thinking about some of those factors that are kind of inherent about shade tolerance and some of those other pieces. And then we were trying to decide, okay, how do we incorporate some of these maybe a kind of environmental kind of components like of flood and fire and drought and initially we have this additional way of thinking about future relevance, right? So drought would be one of those that had this really high future relevance, and we kind of put that on that kind of disturbance kind of score, but it could go either way. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I wasn't sure. It looked like it could go either axis, so just wanted to see.
Yep, I think we had huge debates about that when we were doing that a couple of years ago. So I'm glad to see that you agree.
Yeah, and why don't we start up the demo? And Steve, I think you'll be able to show people where they can see for individual species what each of those adapt pieces are. So that way, if you have to bin them differently, you'll have that available.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do, and my goal here today is, really to reinforce, some of the, great intro that Maria just gave, but also hopefully give you another way to look at it and actually go and use the Atlas. So I'm going to, do a bit of live demo here, and just try to point out a few of the key aspects. The first thing that you'll notice here, this is the version 4 of the Tree Atlas. The older versions are still there, and version 2 is the latest version of the Bird Atlas. So we're going to go in there and explore species, but we do have one of our tutorials that's currently available that really kind of gives a great introduction of this general framework. So what we're going to do is spend about 10 or 12 minutes talking about individual species information, and then we'll take a little pause, answer some questions, and then we're going to talk really about the regional summaries. And again, this is going to hopefully provide a way to think about some of this combining the species information, especially as we go into thinking about vulnerability assessment, adaptation planning, right? This is where that kind of summary of information for given areas will be. And then the final piece, as Maria talked about, we'll talk a little bit about looking at plant hardiness zones, heat zones, growing degree days, other ways when we don't have those specific species information there. And so what I want to do and is just pick a species. I'm going to try to scroll slowly. If I'm scrolling too fast, someone yell at me here. So we go to our webpage. Really, we just kind of redid the Google searches. So anytime you type, Climate Change Atlas, the first choice really is going to be version 4, just to kind of have there. I'm just going to pick a species here. I mean, you can scroll down through all the 125 tree species, 147 bird species, or you can just start typing something. So just for ease of doing this, I'm just gonna do sugar maple, just to do that. So I just started typing it and populated here. So you kind of get that in the queue, and the first thing you'll notice is, right, and we'll talk about some of these components. So sugar maple and then model reliability, and you'll click on that value on that there. And it's gonna take you to the main species page, right? So for each of the species, page is set up the exact same way. And what I want to do, is really just try to point out a couple of the key features and maybe, and some of the new ones as well. So hopefully my screen is going to allow us to see things nicely. So again, just to orient the map center here, there's going to be some interpretations that we can, talk about. This is our general kind of overview of the full story picture here. These other information that we'll get into in adaptability and some summaries, we'll talk about that. But I'm going to focus on the maps now for sugar maple, just to orient ourselves. The first thing you'll notice, right, we have the current inventory. So this is the forest inventory analysis. And your eyes aren't getting fuzzy here, right? Some of the grid cells are a little larger. You'll notice these are 20 by 20 kilometer cells, and some of them are a little smaller. And this is one of our really big improvements. There's a lot of great data throughout the Eastern US, and we can kind of look at things at a little finer resolution now. And so that's going to be an important feature as we think about the new atlas here. So it's a mix of these 20 by 20 kilometer cells and 10 by 10 kilometer cells. And it's a summary of the forest inventory analysis importance values. And so that's what the current looks like. And then we kind of model the current habitat of where sugar maple is across the Eastern US. And again, we still have Little's boundaries kind of here. It's just giving you the overall range background. And so now we see some of those gaps fill in, where the are FIA plots, but those habitat conditions are there. And so this is a good place to just talk a little bit about, what in the heck is going on within the model, right? And so as Maria was saying, there's soil variables, climate variables, soil properties that kind of go into this model. And we actually kind of have that information here. So on that click down menu, I clicked modeled habitat. But if you notice down here, we have this predictors, right? And the values kind of in the square brackets indicate the rank of how important a given variable was for the model. And so we see that this growing season precipitation ranks as second, but what's that first variable, right? What are some of those really critical variables for sugar maple? So I'm sure many of you know, right? Soils are really important for sugar maple. And this kind of component of calcium, cation exchange, right? We know that from other kind of settings, definitely at more regional scales. And what is really interesting and fascinating is that this model and understanding of where the species currently is, right, really kind of pulls out and identifies those, on its own of where sugar maples are. So you can click on these maps if you're interested in looking at soil calcium, there, you can look at that. The precipitation one, since it was the second most important variable, right? We can look and see what that current distribution of precipitation in millimeters looks like. And this is where the climate change piece comes in, as Maria was mentioning. You can actually then start to see, okay, how does precipitation projected to change in the century under a higher emission scenario, right? So in this particular scenario, a reduction across much of the Eastern US with some areas of increase. And that's really the kind of the basis of thinking about current distribution of sugar maple and how that habitat may change going forward. And so I'm just going to pick the average, or I'm just going to pick the Hadley climate change model, and we can look at that under an emission scenario, high emission scenario of 8.5, right? And immediately we can start to see how those habitats are projected to change by the end of the century. Another important component to that, right, is one, to flip back and forth and to think about how those habitats change, filling in some of these areas, declines within some of the core areas of its current high importance values, the blues kind of being more muted towards the greens. I'm going to click on the average of the GCMs, right? So this would be kind of our, ensemble kind of average of the three outputs for feature habitats for sugar maple. And this is kind of the basics of how those habitats would change. And I have to scroll down a little bit, but we do provide some summaries here, right? So under the average of the three, projected of just modest declines overall of their habitats for sugar maple. But what's really important to understand is that those changes are really occurring in different spots, right? And many of those habitats are not likely to be colonized. And that's where this idea of shift comes into play. I know this is a new dimension, so I just want to give you a picture of what this looks like. So what we're saying is if they have our current habitat, right, the areas that are kind of yellowing, right, there's in the end of the century potential for low habitat quality. So the habitat is not necessarily really high. The colonization likelihood is, what is the chance of the species actually making it there in 100 years, looking at that kind of potential natural migration rate. And so for some species like pines, there's potential of 4 generations over the next 100 years. For other species, only 2 or 3. And so what we really see is that future habitat is very much constrained in terms of its potential to make it there at the end of the century. Places, certainly if we think about places in Minnesota, right, there's pretty high potential with decent habitat quality and a pretty a good chance for those to colonize. So that's another important aspect. And you can see that here in the summary information. We're talking about sugar maple, where it's distributed, how habitat's supposed to likely to change, and then what's the chance for that species to infill, right? To fill in some of those gaps within its distribution, right? So that's a general kind of view of it. The adaptability was the other section component of those. And so if we look at sugar maple adaptability, we kind of score all those different biological and disturbance traits. Overall, the 2 strongest positive components would be competition in terms of shade tolerance, and also its kind of broad environmental ability to exist. If you think about sugar maples, occurring into the south in some areas, well into the northeast and northwest, right? It has a pretty broad range. So that's what that is kind of getting at. So you can click on this Modifacts button, which kind of gives you those individual scores for adaptability. And what we start to see is, so the biological characteristics would have to do with shade tolerance, how kind of edaphic specificity, in terms of its conditions, how is it establishing from seedlings? And those are scored and ranked relative to all the other tree species that we look at. So in this case, it goes back to the 134 tree species that we've looked at. And then disturbance, right, would be those other characteristics that change, that are driving, that are influencing from outside. So things like drought and flood and fire and those aspects. And so again, these are all ranked relative to the scored individually from literature, and then we look at them across all the 134 tree species. And so we come down with sugar maple to having a fairly high adaptability. And there's many other aspects here that we can look at. I know I'm about 10 minutes in, so I just want to point out 1 or 2 other things. And as I was talking about the sugar maple kind of example of current habitat and future habitat and what that means, it's also often helpful to look at these summary of predictor change maps because it provides a way to look at things side by side. For one, right, I can click on there, it takes you to a different page, and we can see our current inventory data, our current modeled, and then different projections. But if we want to kind of get a sense spatially of how this looks, of where the gains and losses in habitats would be by the end of the century, I find it helpful to sometimes look at the difference maps, right? And what we see here, if I go down, I'm just going to scroll down to the average GCM model, since that's what we're looking at. Under the higher emission scenario, the goldish areas are really those areas where losses of habitat, based on its current distribution would occur. Those cells where it currently is and where it's losing. The gains in many cases are areas where sugar maple is not necessarily an important tree now. It's certainly there, but we see these gains on the ends. So it's really kind of critical to think about, where the species currently is and how is its habitat projected to change. So I just find it useful to think about that as we start to go through individual species components. There's many other kind of pieces to explore and look at. You know, like I had mentioned, there's a lot of information just on the current species and where it's distributed. You know, lots of information about different habitat projections into the future under different emission scenarios. Looking at shift to get an idea of this colonization potential. And if you're interested more in the types of predictors that are going into the models, to looking at those, and as well as just mapping those to get a sense for, you know, how they occur across landscape, you know, which I think is often really important. So that, anyway, that's for every species we have those components. And the last thing, and I'm saving this for last because I really wanted to stress it, is this idea of the model reliability. And that kind of gets at, you know, how confident are we in our ability to currently model an individual species? So sugar maple, we have pretty high confidence on these 5 different metrics that we look at. And so that's, you know, one thing to be thinking about for each species. And then also that there's these different pieces of information, you know, the cautions that we're just modeling habitat, about future components. We kind of some informations and some frequently asked questions, and we're working on, you know, a user's guide to go along with this and go along with the new Atlas tools. So that just to really kind of provide more ability to use it. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to take
Yes,
now, or should we go into the combined species?
we're gonna take the quickest break just to see one question we had, and I can't remember what this version 4. You can keep your model,
Okay.
your screenshot up, because
Yeah.
we'll pivot over.
Yeah,
But do you offer GIS layers for the new distrib 2 data for people to be able to download and manipulate, or do you, or yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so we do have that. I'm pretty sure they're all up. I'm just gonna. This is a good test for me. This is something that Jim Lutens-White, you know, is kind of developing the background of all this from NRS, and he actually was able to create a separate piece for our publications, right? So they have all these different categories you can search for, and I'm pretty sure if we go to this paper, I clicked on one of them here. A lot of the background data, there should be a link. I'm sorry, we have to go to the individual publication. I just can't recall. I don't have to do it now, but I can do it too later. But the data are available.
I'll do that while you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll find the publication. I know you have so many, it makes it hard. I'll find the publication that has the link to the R&D thing with those. I know where to look. So I'll do that.
And we're also happy to provide like data as well, you know, to these, and just to bring in and to there's a data warehouse, USDA, that has, you know, each species has all the information there, so you can download.
Great. Cool. Well, I'll post that link while you continue on. I think seeing the combined species outputs will be really helpful because some of the questions we're seeing. So let's move on to that so people can see that, and then I think we'll have even more questions.
Okay.
Awesome.
Great. All right. Well, I'm gonna move on and scroll down on my browser here to the combined species information, which, you know, really is this regional summary tables. And there's lots of different ways we can look at this, and we wanted to provide, you know, many different ways to look at it, right? We, you know, folks working in urban areas, you know, we have the different urban components here. I'm just gonna click on this just so you get a sense for the different urban areas, right? So all these different kind of 100 and almost 200 kind of urban areas, you know, different places that we provide kind of a summary of information. But what I want to show now, is these many different ways that we try to break it out that might be useful. Watersheds, the EVAS regions, these 1 by 1 degree cells, you know, which kind of summarize. And if you're not working in national forest, but you're working in, you know, some region and you just want to get a list of species, you know, you can go there. What I'm going to do just to demonstrate this is just look at a national forest, because you know, I think it'll give us a good visual for what's going on. So I just clicked on national forest, and I'm just going to do Allegheny since it's the first one, and it's pretty easy to look at. You know, the one aspect, we're adding maps to all these so we can, you know, where you're clicking here, right? So what I wanted to point out here is, right, we have the national forest boundary for Allegheny. What you'll notice is that there's this black line around it. So what we do for these smaller areas is we just buffer it in order to have enough data, enough of these cells, so that we can make some really kind of informed assessments of the current species there and potential changes. So we often buffer some of these smaller regions to make sure that we have enough information that it's really kind of summarizing the species conditions there. So just to give you a sense for that, the maps there. And there's a couple of different ways to look at these regional summaries. And this really is this, the fact that we often aren't just looking at one species, right? We want to have a sense for what's happening across that tree community and what's the evidence of change, and how can we start thinking about planning for that. So we provide it in two different ways. One is just a PDF, right? So a static PDF, which kind of gives us the list of species that we have here. And so there's a lot kind of going on here. This is where the tutorials will really kind of help you all kind of go through them. And so just wanted to highlight a couple of things. The way that this table kind of is generated, right? It's for Allegheny National Forest and the buffered region around there. So what are all the species that are kind of present currently or have potential future habitat into the future? So of those 125 species, we're talking about 60 species here in this view. Okay, so that's the one thing I wanted to show. The other thing is these are kind of sorted by the species that are most abundant currently within that region, right? So of course, red maple, black cherry, sugar maple, right, are the top kind of 3 species kind of that we have there. And there's different ways to talk about this. What's the percent of the cells? What is the summed importance value? And this is the kind of the metric that we often talk about. So for each cell, right, how abundant, what's the importance value for red maple in this case, right? And then what's that summed across that region? You could also look at it as terms of the average importance value to tell you slightly different components. And then we want to say, what is the potential change in habitat for that species going into the end of the century under the 2 emission scenarios? So the 4.5 and 8.5 emission scenarios, right? So we see potential for large declines in red maple, small declines in red maple under 4.5, large declines under 8.5. And here we see back to this adaptability score. So obviously red maple and sugar maple have these really high adaptability scores, and black cherry not so much, right? And we see some of those, and we can explore some of those if you'd like. We also want to think about how abundant, is that species currently, right? So this is where you see that sorting. And then the capability is really combining the information of how abundant is the species now, what's the potential for change in habitat, and then how adaptable is it going forward. And so this kind of gives us a sense for species that have a capability to cope with the climate change going to the future. And the next piece, and I'm going to do this in a couple different ways. So I know I'm kind of, again, throwing a fire hose, but I just want to kind of give you a sense for the table. What we notice here is this category of infill, and that really relates to the shift or colonization likelihood assessment. So in this case, shagbark hickory, it may occur in some portions, but it's really not abundant. It doesn't really show up on FIA data very much, right? It's there, but not very much. But it has the potential to fill in some of those cells that are currently not occupied within the region. And that's why it has an infill, like a potential for it to increase into some of these currently unoccupied areas, right? Still within its population boundary. And then finally, what I'm going to show you is species that aren't currently within the region necessarily, but have a potential to gain habitat, right? And then what is the potential for it to actually reach that area by the end of the century? So there's potential for it to migrate. And so there's some potential for species like Virginia pine, Virginia pine, shortleaf pine, to make it there, but it's really going to be hard for it, right? So we try to quantify that ability there. So what I wanted to do, and that's great, and that's nice to look at the summary table, but it's often nice to sometimes just look at the Excel table, right? So you can manipulate these data. You guys are using these different data at different levels, right? And so once you start getting used to playing with it, it can be really helpful to just download this as an Excel file, right? This is the same table we were just looking at for the Allegheny. We have all those categories, but it's really helpful, right? Maybe you want to know what a definition is, right, of some of these components. And so we try to provide definitions for each of those columns. You know, capability, you know, for that species to cope with climate change. You know, we kind of describe what we're talking about there. Infill and migrate, what does that mean? And so on and so forth. We often also provide some questions you can ask the table, so you can really kind of interact with your region of interest, and as well as some, you know, interpretations of what these columns are kind of getting at and trying to capture. But what this really hopes to give you is an opportunity to really start to dive into some of these individual species here. But looking at it within your region of interest, kind of the combined species viewpoint. So if I go back to the atlas, what I want to do is, you know, let's take a species. You know, well, we can go back to sugar maple if we want, or we can go look at American beech, you know, for example, since, you know, it kind of has a little different component, right? It's currently abundant within the region. It has potential for large declines in habitat. Adaptability is not as high, and under current information, right? This was done a couple years ago. It's probably even worse with, you know, with beech leaf disease and those other aspects. So it only has this kind of fair capability to cope under climate change, and it's not one, right, that is projected to have a really strong, robust kind of habitat. So if you're interested in that, right, you may go back to the atlas page, and you may say, okay, what does, you know, beech look like in this region? And you may say, oh, you know, what's the kind of future habitat projected? Well, there's a lot of potential gains, right, in the area, but what you notice, you know, is there's really quite a substantial potential for losses right around that Allegheny region, right? So that's one way to think about it. The other one of the infill species was that shagbark or pignut hickory? I was going too fast. I'm gonna go with shagbark. I might have been pignut. I apologize. Not currently. Was it shagbark? I'm gonna cheat. I'm gonna go back. It was shagbark. Okay, not necessarily currently very abundant within the region. Certainly present within the Allegheny region, a couple cells. Right, it had that potential to increase in habitat. It kind of is muted out, right? But increase in some ways. And then we can say, what is the potential for it to colonize? And it kind of has this, you know, kind of lower habitat quality, but a pretty decent chance of actually throwing darts out in seeds making it to the region. So just to give you a sense for kind of how that combined species information kind of goes hand in hand with the individual species components. Again, you know, there's lots of other ways to explore. You know, the one by ones is a nice way if you have a particular, you know, region that you want to kind of explore. You can get all the information for, you know, like for me in Columbus, I may do negative, you know, the latitude and longitude, you know, -82, 39. You know, get that same species list, and we try to make it so that you can get some of that more kind of localized information. I know that was about 11 minutes. There's lots of other things to talk about with it. And I know that's definitely a fire hose because there's like these tables with species, but I just want hopefully give you a sense for, we're trying to add these pieces so people can grab these sheets, you know, start to really sit down with your local knowledge, local understanding of what's happening, and really start to, you know, evaluate the evidence, you know, across species to think about, you know, climate change as we go forward within a given forest.
This is great, Steve. Let's see, I'm looking at the questions. Can you bring the spreadsheet up? I have one or two questions I think we can tackle here, and then we can see if anyone else has a quick question, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So Luke, so I guess first, I just wanted to point out that definitions short tab, the second tab was somebody had asked and just confirming for everyone, like that's your glossary, if you need to go back and kind of look at what things are, just wanted to emphasize that for people that came up in the chat.
Yeah.
And then there's other tabs too. I mean, there's a whole book of information in here, so it definitely takes some time. And again, we're working on a user's guide, but it's in here. So definitely download the spreadsheets and just take your time with them. Then, yeah, if you want to go back to the spreadsheet, Luke had asked a question about, is there a degree of confidence by species of the prediction? And he's, kind of wanting to not accidentally kick out species that are being that are not appropriate. And so I wonder if you could cover the model reliability a little bit more in this context. Thank you, since that is the thing we always remind people of. So hit the model reliability again.
Yep, and I totally skipped over that column. Yeah, no, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, so what the model reliability is doing is essentially trying to evaluate, based on the current distribution of the species, how well does the model, capture that pattern? And I can, point you to the specific information around it, but what we're trying to say is, okay, so these models are made up of things that run like 1,000 times, and one of the components we want to say is, oh, how stable is that model? So each time you do it, are you getting consistent results? And if you are, that gives us confidence that that pattern that it's describing is fairly robust. The other is, how well does it represent spatially what's going on, right? So is there a classification error, right? Is it saying the importance value should be 60 in this cell and it's only predicting 30? Well, that's not good, especially if that goes across. So high reliabilities kind of have these 5 attributes. So that gives us confidence about current distribution. Going into the future, it's important to think about how much that species is currently present there and what's the magnitude of that change, right? Is it a currently really abundant species that has potentials to decline, but it still may have a lot of suitable habitat there? So that's where it's important to think about its current distribution, how abundant it is, how much that change would be, and then this idea of adaptability. And again, the adaptability is meant as a reality check about some of those other conditions, but it's also really important to use your local knowledge about some of those conditions. Like for me, like in Ohio, we just did a paper that looked at differences in established mortality for different oaks, and red oak had some different patterns in southern Ohio than it would in Pennsylvania. So it's important that you kind of incorporate that local knowledge in the adaptability. That kind of is a guideline of species-wide pieces. So I don't know if that kind of starts to cover it. So that's kind of how we try to build these layers of confidence a little bit. But it all starts with model reliability in many ways.
Yep, exactly. And so, yeah, so Luke pointed out the definitions tab doesn't include what lost meant. And so, yeah, that means that it's likely to be lost from its range, and it's additive. So it might not be in there, but you figured it out. And so exactly, yeah, what people do is, like you kind of sort, like Luke said, he sorts, by capability 8.5 and just goes from there. And I've definitely done that as well. So, yeah, it is really helpful to be able to kind of sort through these. I've, have done the same thing for my property in terms of, this. I have one other question before we move on. And so we have a few folks from Ontario in our class. And so I wanted to, they'd asked if there was something similar for Canada. So I'm going to post the range-wide paper in the chat, but I wanted to see if you had any other comments. I was thinking, I think you should talk about the range-wide data that you've been doing with the Canadians. And I will point out that the Canadians do have some niche models that have, species projections too. So, but if you want to just talk about what species are covered in your Canadian work, that'd be great.
Sure, yeah, and yeah, if you'll post a paper, that'd be awesome. So I just realized that paper is too recent to even show up in our citations here. But anyway, yes, so we, for a long time, we've been wanting to work with, folks from the Canadian Forest Service, Dan McKinney, John Pedler, because they have, done a lot of great work when it relates to individual species, we really have, for a decade wanted to have a more range-wide kind of assessment. So in that paper, which is in diversity distributions, we look at 25 species that we have enough data for, because there's different data sources, different ways in which inventory data were collected and done. So that paper kind of looks at those 25 common species where we felt that the data were congruent enough to go across the border. And it provides, just like we talked about here, habitat as well as colonization likelihood for those 25 species. And they're kind of the major kind of species that we have, across the two. So that's one way to look at it. And it's also really interesting, as we start thinking about the research and similarities, the ways we've kind of gone back a good ways with collaborating with Dan and John specifically, but with others as well, talking about system migration and talking about, what it means to model different presence or absence or abundance like we're modeling here. So it's a really great collaboration. We're trying to work that in. Our atlas here just focuses on the Eastern US, but some of that information is starting to get out there. It's the same, it's the same general kind of sense framework that we use. I mean, the data are a little bit different, so it's not quite this continuous measure of abundance. It's a little bit more of categories, and that's the kind of the best we can do.
Great. That sounds great. So we're doing good on time. There's a lot to cover, but people are asking good questions. So yeah, let's cover the heat hardiness zones for people. Someone had asked about, what about native shrubs? And I was describing in the chat how, because the atlas, you can just switch your slides over, because the atlas is, based on Forest Service forest inventory and analysis data, the trees have to be big enough to be measured. And so it, it includes service-bearing black willow and redbud and some small trees, but it doesn't include shrubs. And so this is a method that you can use if you're working in an urban area and that, you have maybe non-native species or different species, or if you're interested in plants or shrubs that aren't included in the atlas. This is kind of another way you can use to get a sense of general risk without of a species and where it might go, just kind of thinking about where it's found now. So,
Well, I think it's really a great component of it. And it's one of these great examples of how all this why it's so great to work together with coming up with different ideas of how to kind of glean as much information as we can and really kind of try to move the science forward. So it's a great example, of it. Because our initial ideas, with this were when the more recent GCMs came out, we wanted to kind of incorporate those data into our models, and so they are the RCP5s, AR5 models within there. So the RCPs 8.5 and 4.5. So we wanted to make sure our models are updated. And then we knew that there was an opportunity to then capture some of those other components of climate that are also important just to understand how they play out across the U.S. and at least a little bit into Canada and Mexico in this case. And so we kind of developed these ideas of looking at some of these general stressors for plants across the U.S. Primarily. So we are interested in summarizing data for heat zones, hardiness zones, and growing degree days. So again, when we're talking about I'm just going to talk about hardiness zones and heat zones here. So hardiness zones are those minimum temperatures that we reach kind of each year, and that's averaged over these kind of 30-year time windows. Heat zones are the number of days over 86 degrees, and cumulatively average for each year kind of averaged over the 30-year period. And so it kind of gives us this picture of stress both in cold and stress in terms of heat, and then growing degree days. We can think about how growing degree days change as well through time. And so that's really where we started. And so we have a story map, which is one way, and a data viewer that we can look at historic and end of century or changes in these three metrics that provide us a picture of how the climate is changing, how this may impact plants, and as Maria was saying, not just the ones that we have modeled, because the ones we've modeled include climate, but also soils and other information. This is kind of a good layer to look at how much the magnitude of climate change going forward. And so this is where the data viewer is. We can go there in a minute, and I can show you how that works. But that's kind of what we can swipe back and forth and look at those. Just to get at also from there, you can actually go to a ArcGIS online site with those and download those data. And you kind of see here we have like plant hardiness zones up, end of century under the different emission scenarios, higher and low, and then we have different time periods as well, right? So end of century and then middle of century. And so you can download those data, you can manipulate them online, or you can download and work on them yourself. And they really provide the sense for how the climate is projected to change over the next century. And so as Maria was saying, right, this is a really great way, this is the specific place to download them. How we can start thinking about species that we haven't modeled. And again, this goes Leslie has really kind of developed the way in which these climate indicators can be used to think about species we haven't necessarily modeled. So it really is this kind of first principle, first approximation of where current species zone is, how that zone is projected to change, and then kind of lining up if there's a mismatch, right? So again, it gives us an indication of how these line up just in climate space per se. So the example here is like if we were to look at the white spruce kind of that grow in the Black Hills region in South Dakota, kind of the variety that we'd have there, right? We can look up online, get a sense of the hardiness zones, get a sense for the heat zones. So ranges in those zones from 2 to 8, heat zones from 1 to 7. We can then go to our site and then look at for that specific region, what is the current hardiness zone, what is the and what is the potential future hardiness zone. So we can see for hardiness zones, the future kind of projection in that region, South Dakota, Wyoming, would range between 6 and 8, right? So it still kind of fits in the upper, it fits within the hardiness zones for spruce, of course, right? Because it's at the southern edge of its range extent, right? So that matches in many ways. It's not a pressure there about it being too cold, right? As we move through climate change. Where we see the potential mismatch in this example would be on the heat zone side. So there's a number of days that are over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And so in the future, in that portion of Wyoming, South Dakota, the heat zone range is between the 7 and 8 period, which, let me try to think about what that is in the future. So that would, kind of essentially move up the number of days, from 45 days above that temperature, to anywhere between 60 to 120 days above per year over the 86 degree value. So we're really getting to that point where we start thinking about heat stress and those other aspects. And so we can start to compare, right, how these two ends of the spectrum, cold limitation, heat stress, and how that would affect the plant as well as competition can start to come into play. So you can really start to do these kind of back of the envelope kind of comparisons to think about. So hardiness zone for white spruce and the Black Hills, right? Black Hills spruce would be not as much of a concern, right? But the future heat zone could potentially indicate more of this negative impact there. And so I guess what I can do really quickly is I can just show you what that looks like, right, on the atlas. So you can get to it right here at the bottom of the site. It takes you to the story map, which is a kind of a nice interactive tool that we developed, a couple of years ago with these models. And so let's say we're interested in the hardiness zone, plant hardiness zones, right? We know what our plant hardiness zones typically, look like under current conditions, right? These would match, what we would typically see kind of broken into these several degree kind of components, right? We're essentially looking at every 2 or so degrees here, current conditions, and then we can swipe across to get a picture of that. We can get a sense for how those hardiness zones in the future versus current conditions. I should have had current this way first. And so that's one way we can do it. And then just to reiterate, right, the heat zones would be down here, right? That would change the map, so the number of days over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And again, just like we did with the hardiness zones, you can start to look at potential for those changes, like current heat zones and then potential future. So a lot more hotter days going forward. And again, all the data would be you can go to by clicking and going to that AGUL server, and that's where you can start to download the data or start to do more stuff with them too. Look at different time periods if you're interested in different time periods. So lots of different ways to interact with and download the data. As you start thinking about all the other hundreds of other plant species that we have no distributions models for, at least it starts to give us a profile of the types of climatic conditions they would face going forward. So I can go on, but I think I might just pause there just so we can have time to talk about things.
Yeah, that's great. All right, we are at technically at time. Feel free to stay on. We knew that we were going to fill up the hour, and so definitely jump off if you need to, but we'll stick on for a bit longer. I think let's see, chat in if you had any questions about the heat hardiness zone piece. I haven't seen any questions specifically on that. We've been having some conversation in the chat about kind of low model reliability species and species maybe not showing up in areas like Iowa that don't have a lot of forest, and maybe that's related to the just lack of FIA plots. And so sometimes I think one thing is if you're looking at those species data tables for your area is to make sure that when you're grabbing a geography, you're thinking about how much forest is in it. So for instance, I work in the Northeast a lot, and so sometimes people want to grab the 1 by 1 degree data because it's the smallest, but let's say you're in Rhode Island and half of your plot falls in the Atlantic Ocean, it's not really representing as much forest. And so if you're in a heavily non-forested area, you may want to consider kind of using a watershed or an ecoregion or kind of a slightly larger geography that makes sense in terms of capturing that. Let's see here. So we will do that. And the other thing I wanted to show, Danielle reminded me before we jump off is I know that this can be overwhelming for a lot of folks. I think we have a lot of advanced users in this particular course, and so we wanted to give people all of the details. But if you're feeling really overwhelmed, one of the things, and maybe Danielle, you can drop the link in the chat, is that we've created these 2-page handouts. Some of these are using the slightly older Distrib 2 data. We've been updating, or Distrib data, we're updating them for the Distrib 2 data. But we do have kind of these 1-page handouts that hit the high points of these species and kind of the main pieces of adaptability, habitat change, and kind of the projections, but in this much more simpler graphical way. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by the giant tables, do check out and see, and if you want these can be more useful, or if you need a quick reference for, sorry, I slept scrolling around. If you need a quick reference for, being in the field, or, want to share something with partners, and, people who aren't necessarily the advanced users and wanting to pour over the spreadsheets, these are available. So we wanted to make you aware of that as well. So these are kind of the quick sheets we've been developing, and these are on our forest adaptation site.
Are they available by state?
They are available by ecoregion, and we're working on developing them by state. What state are you in, Jennifer? I forget.
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I will see. We have.
Yes,
Okay.
there is Pennsylvania specific and Pennsylvania eco-regional specific. So
Yeah.
you can even get really slice and dice.
Mhm.
I'll send you an email, Jennifer, okay?
Thank you.
Wonderful. Let's see here. So then, let's see. Leslie had a comment about changes in heat zone also affect pests that might occur in particular species. So earlier spring and late fall extend the time that needle casts are spread. And yeah, so that's like a great application of that heat hardiness zone beyond anything we described is, if you're able to identify that, basically, hemlock woolly adelgid is going to have mortality wherever you have a plant hardiness zone 4. You can use this to kind of be like, okay, well, this is where it might be in the future and kind of use it that way. And same thing with the growing season. So that's a great example of another application. So thank you. We're learning stuff too. All right, well, are there any other questions from folks? Feel free to turn on your video. Again, we can stick around for a little bit longer. I'm gonna stop recording in case, I think we caught it. No other comments are coming in.